approval. No comment has been received from the government of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics regarding the Russian language version. The Japanese language version has the approval of the Japanese government. All steps possible under the circumstances have been taken to assure conformity with the English, French, Russian, Spanish, and Japanese language versions of the Treaty of Peace with Japan, the two declarations, and the protocol.
The report of the Secretary General concludes the business of the conference this evening. The ceremony of signing the Treaty of Peace with Japan will take place in this hall at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Is there any further business to come before this session of the conference? There being no further business, this session is adjourned.
And thus comes to an end tonight's session of the Japanese Peace Conference here at the War Memorial Opera Hall in San Francisco. A telecast brought to you by the combined television industry of the United States. Tonight's was indeed a dramatic session. You see Mr. Gromyko and the Russian delegation as they leave now with their heavy uniformed bodyguard from the San Francisco Police Department. They're met outside by a State Patrol bodyguard and Secret Service agents and whisked back to their Hillsborough house outside of San Francisco. The Russians provided real drama here this evening, as in the midst of a speech by Minister of State Kenneth Younger of England, after the Russians had been knocked down in an effort to bring amendments before the conference at this late date. At that stage, Mr. Gromyko walked out of the conference up the long center aisle. The Czechoslovakian delegation got up and followed. The Polish delegation got up and followed. Somebody ordered up the Russian cars. Whether it was the Russians themselves or not, we do not know, but the Russian limousines whisked into the front of the building to pick up the delegations, and once out on the outside of the building, nearly to the steps themselves, the Russians changed their minds. There's Mr. Gromyko talking with Mr. Werblowski, the Polish delegate. We have been advised that Mr. Gromyko has called a news conference for tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Pacific time. Mr. Gromyko or one of the Russian delegation expect to speak to newsmen and the Veterans Building, which are the news headquarters for this conference in a neighboring building to the Opera Hall. Mr. Atchison is seen receiving the congratulations from other delegations. Again, Mr. Atchison handled the chairmanship duties with extreme firmness. He read the letter of the law to the Russians, the Poles, and the Czechs, did not permit them to bring up their suggested amendments. Mr. Atchison called them the Russian so-called amendments, inasmuch as when Mr. Gromyko was giving his one-hour address to the conference yesterday and was called to order for attempting to bring in amendments at that time, he said they were not amendments. They were merely part of his remarks. Tonight, he made the claim that they were officially amendments brought before this meeting. Mr. Atchison had to rule him out of order. As we saw, Mr. Gromyko objected to that ruling, appealed it, and the appeal was overruled. Mr. Atchison was upheld by, again, the overwhelming vote of all the other nations except those communist nations here, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia. Thus, the Japanese Peace Treaty Conference has been brought to an end as far as the formal business goes. As Mr. Atchison announced to us, only the signing remains, and just before this meeting began this evening, the nations announced that they intended to sign all but the communists. 48 allied nations will sign the treaty tomorrow morning. That was Representative Judd, a student of the Far East, though a frequent critic of the administration policy toward the Far East, the man who a moment ago spoke to Mr. Atchison, waved to him with a jaunty smile and turned away. There are many here at the San Francisco conference who see possible political implications in the strong position Mr. Acheson took here vis-a-vis the Russians, the strong attitude he showed them that this conference had no intention of brooking interference from them. Mr. Dulles is signing autographs down there. He's a popular hero of this evening and of this entire conference. He is called the father of the Japanese peace treaty. We've had no explanation yet, although newsmen have been attempting to get it, of the Russian action this evening in their seeming walkout from this conference. Certainly caused a furor here in the hall, so much so that Mr. Acheson begged the hall to come to a quiet so Mr. Younger could continue his remarks. One explanation that has been offered is that Mr. Gromyko merely left the hall, went to the corridor to smoke a cigarette, but that the Czechoslovakian and Polish delegations, expecting some such cue from him, followed along and were surprised themselves to get to the outside and find it was not a walkout, but merely a recess. However, that is simply speculation. The fact that the Russian cars were ordered up makes it appear more likely that Mr. Gromyko actually planned a walkout at that time, but for some reason changed his mind after once reaching the outside of the hall. Tonight's session was highlighted by the attempt of the Russians again to bring in their amendments to the treaty, which in effect are a new treaty itself. They also came in again with their claim that this is not a treaty of peace, but a treaty of war, and the very serious claim that it arranges an alliance between Japan and the United States for aggression in the Pacific. This is considered indeed serious by all concerned here because of the mutual aid pact between China, that is Red China, and the Soviet Union, a pact that provides that should Japan again attempt aggression or threaten aggression against either of the signers, Russia or Red China, and any nation allied with Japan shall be considered enemies of those countries. The groundwork thus was laid here by Russia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia to invoke such mutual aid treaties in the future if they deem that necessary to their own plans. The signing ceremony for the conference and the peace treaty with Japan will be held tomorrow morning, as you heard, at 10 o'clock Pacific time. We take you now down to the lobby where Bob McCormick is.
United Kingdom, just as he was leaving. Mr. Younger, this session tonight definitely ends all possibility of trouble with the Soviet bloc, doesn't it, as far as the treaty is concerned?
I should think so. I see no other difficulties ahead of us.
Well, you were speaking, weren't you, when the, what shall we call it, the phony walkout occurred? Did it disturb you very much?
No, I won't say it disturbed me. I just had to stop until it was all over. But I realized that it was really big news to find the Soviet delegate was human after all.
What do you think of the whole thing now that it's over for all practical purposes?
Well, that's almost asking me to make a speech again, isn't it?
Yes,
it's
go
a big
ahead.
question. No, I'm not making any more speeches tonight, but I think it's very satisfactory. What we've proved here is that the enormous majority of all the countries at war with Japan want a treaty pretty well like the one we've got. They've got their little reservations, but they think we've done the right thing on the whole, on the right principles.
Do you think the Soviet actually can make much propaganda use in Asia of what's occurred here? It seemed to me certainly that for American consumption that their attempted propaganda must have backfired. Will it be effective in the Asiatic countries, do you think?
Well, I shouldn't have thought so myself, because as I said in my speech tonight, I think the counter-proposals they've put up are proposals that most of the countries of Asia wouldn't look at. I think that, for instance, the Indians would very much sooner have the treaty that we've got here than the one that the Soviet were proposing.
In other words, actually, they were not speaking for the Asiatics. They were simply pretending to speak for the Asiatics.
Well, I just wouldn't know. I've been wondering who they were speaking to. I can't think of anybody much.
Well, thank you very much.
Except the faithful everywhere, of course.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Younger, and that was a beautiful speech. Most sincerely it was.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. And now let's go back up for a while to the booth.
This is Walter Cronkite again in the CBS television booth above Memorial Hall, where the last business session of the Japanese Peace Conference has just been brought to an end. All that remains now is the formal signing of the treaty. Tomorrow morning, all 48 of the non-communist nations represented here have announced their intention to sign, some with a few reservations indeed, but they are all going to sign, putting nationalistic prejudices aside in favor of a treaty they believe will bring international peace a little bit closer in the Far East. Tonight's session had an address from Mr. Shigeru Yoshida, the Premier of Japan, the first time that a Japanese diplomat and government official has addressed an international gathering of this nature since Japan went to war against these countries represented here some 10 long years ago. Mr. Yoshida, in his address, promised again and again that Japan will live up to the agreements she makes in this treaty. He said that it would be very difficult for her indeed to pay reparations to the nations that may come to her and ask for them. This treaty, as you know, provides that those reparations will be the subject of future negotiations, bilateral negotiations with Japan, and no direct reparations are taken care of in this treaty itself, or provided in the treaty. Mr. Yoshida said that some other nations might have to help Japan indeed to pay other nations if they do get reparations. He obviously meant that the United States would have to increase economic aid to Japan if she is going to have to give reparations to other nations. He seemed to put us on notice to that effect. He also said that Japan certainly had no aggressive plans in the future, that he said in effect that she had learned her lesson in World War II. And he pledged, as I say, again and again, that Japan will live up to all of her international agreements and that a new Japan will wants to live as a friendly neighbor to the rest of the world. Seen in the corridor outside of the main hall here at the Memorial Opera House in San Francisco. After Mr. Yoshida's speech, the conference was opened up again to the question of future speeches. Although it was hoped that they would be closed off, Mr. Gromyko got up and again attempted to put in amendments to this treaty at this 11th hour. He was voted down. It led to quite a procedural wrangle, and Mr. Gromyko at one point walked out of the conference, walked out of the hall, that is, but not out of the conference. He walked out into the corridor. Scarf called for him, but he changed his mind, and Mr. Gromyko, the Czechoslovakian and Polish delegations all returned to the hall. This has been Walter Cronkite reporting to you from the War Memorial Opera House in San Francisco, the last business session of the Japanese Peace Treaty Conference here in San Francisco. You have been present at the Japanese Peace Conference brought to you by the television networks and stations of the United States.
This is the CBS television network.